Hello, this is Dr. Bev Knox, your psychology exam study buddy. And in today's episode, we are going to be reviewing learning concepts, basic learning concepts of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So as you know, in one episode, and this is episode 14, I go over the theory, and I do it pretty slowly to help you soak in the information into your long-term memory. And in the following episode, and for this period of episode, it'll be episode 15, I go over actual questions and answers from an actual psychology exam testing bank to assist you in acing your psychology course, okay? Alrighty, so let's get started with information for basic learning concepts in classical conditioning. So the first thing we do is we want to define learning. What does it mean? Well, learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. So learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Now, by learning, we humans adapt to our environment. We learn to expect and prepare for significant events such as food or pain, which is classical conditioning. And we will get to these definitions in a minute. We also learn to repeat acts that bring rewards and avoid acts that bring unwanted results through operant conditioning. And we learn new behaviors by observing events and people. Through language, we learn things we have neither experienced nor observed. And that's cognitive learning. So the definition of learning, which you need to know, is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Now, associative learning is learning that certain events occur together. Associative learning is learning that certain events occur together. The events may be two stimuli, as in classical conditioning, or a response and its consequence, such as operant conditioning. Okay? So associative learning is learning that certain events occur together. What is associative learning? I want you to think about it and repeat after me in your mind. Associative learning is learning that certain events occur together. So by linking two events that occur close together, right, that is called associative learning. Now, a stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. A stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. So in classical conditioning, we learn to associate two stimuli and thus to anticipate events. A stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. We learn that a flash of lightning signals an impending crack of thunder. When the lightning flashes nearby, we start to brace ourselves because we know that, oops, that loud, crackling sound of thunder is on its way. So we associate stimuli that we do not control, and we respond automatically, exhibiting respondent behavior. Okay, so a stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. What is a stimulus? That's right. It's any event or situation that evokes a response. Now, respondent behavior is behavior that occurs as an automatic response to some stimulus. So remember that, okay? A respondent behavior is basically any behavior that occurs as an automatic response. You got to know this. Any behavior that occurs as an automatic response to some stimulus. That is respondent behavior. What is respondent behavior? That's right. It's any behavior that occurs as an automatic response to some stimulus. Okay, so let's move on to operant behavior. Operant behavior is behavior that operates on the environment, producing consequences. Operant behavior is behavior that operates on the environment, producing consequences. So in operant conditioning, we learn to associate a response, which is our behavior, and its consequence. Thus, we and other animals learn to repeat acts followed by good results and avoid acts followed by bad results. These associations produce what we call operant behaviors, which operate on the environment to produce a consequence. Now, again, operant behavior is behaviors that operates where? That's right, on the environment. To do what? To produce consequences. Okay, so cognitive learning is the acquisition of mental information, whether by observing events, by watching others, or through language. So cognitive learning is the acquisition of mental information, whether by observing events, by watching others, or through language. All right? So conditioning is not the only form of learning, okay? Through cognitive learning, we acquire mental information that guides our behavior. Observational learning, one form of cognitive learning, lets us learn from others' experiences. And we will go more in depth in regards to observational learning a little later on. But now let's start over. Let's get to classical conditioning, because we want to go ahead and just define that, a little bit more, okay? So classical conditioning, and we're going to do classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning a little bit more in depth. So classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we link two or more stimuli as a result to illustrate with Pavlov's classic experiment. The first stimulus, which is a tone, comes to elicit behavior, which is drooling, in anticipation of the second stimulus, which is food. And I will talk about this some more, but this is an experiment that you really need to know, okay? You need to know the name Ivan Pavlov and associate the name Ivan Pavlov with classical conditioning. And I do have a learning video lecture on classical and operant conditioning, and it actually goes more in depth and shows you pictures and all that in regards to these classic experiments. So Pavlov experiment, or Pavlovs Dog Experiment, you'll hear it called a lot, is something that you need to know, okay? So for many people, the name Ivan Pavlov rings a bell. Okay, so most of us know this already. And in his early 20th century experiments, now psychology's most famous research are classic. So we call these our classic research studies in psychology. The phenomena he explored, we justify by calling it classical conditioning. So again, classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we link two or more stimulus as a result to illustrate with Pavlov's classic experiment. The first stimulus, which is a tone, comes to elicit behavior, which is drooling, in anticipation of the second stimulus, which is food. So Pavlov and his assistants tried to imagine that what the dog was thinking and feeling as it drooled in anticipation of the food. Now, this only led them into fruitless debates, okay? So, to explore the phenomena more objectively, they experimented. To eliminate other possible influences, they isolated the dog in a small room, secured it in a harness, and attached a device to divert its saliva to a measuring instrument, okay? From the next room, they presented food. First, by sliding it in a food bowl. Later, by blowing meat powder into the dog's mouth at a precise moment. They then paired various neutral stimuli, and that's a word we'll go over in a minute, but they then paired neutral stimuli, events the dog could see or hear but didn't associate with food in the dog's mouth. So they paired a neutral stimuli, which is events the dog could see or hear but really didn't associate that event with food. With the dog. Now, neutral stimulus, again, that's something you need to know. In classical conditioning, it is a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning. So, neutral stimulus in classical conditioning, it is a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning. So, again, they paired various neutral stimuli. And what is that again? Events the dog could see or hear but didn't associate with food. So they paired neutral stimuli with food in the dog's mouth. If a sight or sound regularly signaled the arrival of food, would the dog learn the link? That's the question. Would the dog learn the link? If so, would it begin salivating in anticipation of the food? And the answers proved to be yes and yes. Just before placing the food in the dog's mouth to produce salivation, Pavlov sounded a tone. After several pairings of the tone and food, the dog, now anticipating the meat powder, began salivating to the tone. So again, after several pairings of the tone and the food, the dog, now anticipating the meat powder, began salivating to the tone alone. In later experiments, a buzzer, a light, a touch on the leg, even the sight of a circle would set off the drooling of saliva. Okay? So this procedure works with people also, not just dogs. When hungry, people actually can begin to smell, certain types of food without actually seeing the food. So this works with humans too, as well as animals. So back to what I was just talking about. After Pavlov sounded a tone several times, so after several pairings of the tone and food, the dog, who was now anticipating the meat powder, began salivating to the tone alone. And again, in neutral stimulus means, in classical conditioning, a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning. So the neutral stimulus could really be anything, okay? So to continue with Pavlovs Dog Experiment. So a dog does not learn to salivate in response to food in its mouth. Rather, food in the mouth automatically, unconditionally, now here's the word you have to remember with classical conditioning. If you're taking notes right now, I want you to write classical conditioning. I also want you to write Pavlov's Dog Experiment. These are all words of association that's going to help you with remembering key points for getting questions right on your psychology exam. So under classical conditioning, you need to write down Pavlov, okay, and his dog experiment. But I also want you to write down the word unconditional, okay, or unconditionally. Because under operant conditioning, it's going to be, the word's going to be voluntary that I'm going to ask you to write down, okay? So with food in the mouth, automatically, unconditionally triggers a dog's saliva, okay? So the reflexes that produce the saliva is unconditionally triggered. Thus, Pavlov called this drooling an unconditioned response. And he called the food an unconditioned stimulus. Now let's go over these definitions a little bit in detail because I know when I was studying this stuff back 117 years ago when I was in college, in order for me to understand the definition of classical conditioning, I had to go back and really learn the definition of words that were in the definition of classical conditioning. So, like for example, one of the words were unconditioned response. And some of you are like, oh my gosh, what is that? What does that mean? So let's learn right now what an unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, conditioned response, and conditioned stimulus mean. Okay? So an unconditioned response just basically means in classical conditioning, an unlearned, naturally occurring response, such as salivation, to an unconditioned stimulus, such as food in the mouth. So an unconditioned response is an unlearned, naturally occurring response, such as salivation, to an unconditioned stimulus, such as food in the mouth. So that's an unconditioned response. Now, an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers an unconditioned response. So an unconditioned stimulus, which is a stimulus that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers an unconditioned response. And an unconditioned response is an unlearned, naturally occurring response, such as salivation, to an unconditioned stimulus, such as food in the mouth. Okay, now a conditioned response is a learned response. That's why it says condition. A conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. All right? A conditioned response in classical conditioning is a learned response. So a conditioned response just means a learned response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. And a conditioned stimulus in classical conditioning, an originally neutral stimulus that after association with an unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. So a conditioned stimulus, an originally neutral stimulus, that after association with an unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. I know that's a lot of definitions at once, but now let's go back to Pavlov's dog and try to use some of these definitions to explain the experiment itself. So, A dog does not learn to salivate in response to food in its mouth. Rather, as stated before, food in the mouth automatically, unconditionally triggers a dog's to salivate. Now, Pavlov called this drooling, which is the salivation, and you'll hear some people call it the spittle. Okay, it just means the same thing, salivation. Pavlov's called this drooling an unconditioned response, and he called the food an unconditioned stimulus. So salivation in response to a tone, however, is learned. It is conditional upon the dogs associating the tone with the food. Thus, we call this response the conditioned response. The stimulus that used to be neutral, and in this case, a previously meaningless tone that now triggers salivation, is the conditioned stimulus. Distinguishing these two kinds of stimuli and responses is pretty much easy. Just remember, conditioned means learned, and unconditioned means unlearned. Again, distinguishing these two kinds of stimuli can be pretty simple if you remember this. If you remember that conditioned equals learned, unconditioned equals unlearned. Okay? So again, these definitions are crucial in understanding classical conditioning. Now, let's move on to acquisition. Okay? Acquisition in classical conditioning, the initial stage when one links a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus to that, the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response. In operant conditioning, the strengthening of a reinforced response. Okay, so to understand the acquisition or initial learning of the stimulus-response relationship, Pavlov and his associates wondered, how much time should lapse between presenting the NS, and we know what that is, right? That is the tone or the light or the touch, and the food. So in most cases, not much, half a second usually works well. Okay? All right, so acquisition means when one links a neutral stimulus, and that's what NS means. It means neutral stimulus, and an unconditioned stimulus, so that the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response. Okay? All right, so let's see. Let's move on. In some textbooks and maybe even in some quizzes, you'll see they use the initials for these things, and I just want to go over that real quick, just in case you were to see these. So if you were to see NS, it means neutral stimulus. US means unconditioned stimulus. UR, unconditioned response. CS, conditioned stimulus, and CR, conditioned response. Again, NS, neutral stimulus, US, unconditioned stimulus, UR, conditioned response, CS, conditioned stimulus, and CR, conditioned response. Okay, so let's move on to another definition. Let's see, I got a couple more here for you. Extinction, the diminution of a conditioned response, occurs in classical conditioning when the unconditioned stimulus, which is the US, does not follow a conditioned stimulus, which is the CS. It occurs in operant conditioning when a response is no longer reinforced. Okay, so that's extinction. Spontaneous recovery is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned response. So conditioning is very important, and we know that, okay? And conditioning means what? Learned. Remember that. Conditioning means learned. So in spontaneous recovery, it is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned response. Okay, generalization is the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit similar responses. I'm going to go a little bit slower because I want you to grasp the content, okay? Because I do want you to ace your psychology exam. Okay, so in generalization, it is the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit similar responses. In operant conditioning, generalization occurs when responses learned in one situation occur in a similar situation. Okay, now discrimination in classical conditioning is learned. Now, this is not the discrimination in regards to social psychology when we talk about prejudice and discrimination, okay? So in classical conditioning, discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and similar stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. Let's review this again. In classical conditioning, discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and similar stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, the ability to distinguish responses that are reinforced from similar responses that are not reinforced. Okay? So in classical conditioning, discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and similar stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, now let's move on to operant conditioning. And again, in this episode, I'm going to be going over classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And I am going to record all three on this one episode. So if you want, you could actually, just pause this episode right here and go back and relearn everything we just talked about in regards to classical conditioning before you move on to operant conditioning. You may want to do that maybe 2 or 3 times before moving on to operant conditioning. If you feel that you've pretty much grasped the concept, you've taken notes, and you're pretty much okay, then fine, just continue with this episode, okay? So we're now moving on to operant conditioning. And a few definitions that we need to understand. First thing is a definition of learning, okay? Learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. And I know we spoke of that at the beginning of this episode. It is one thing to classically condition a dog to salivate to the sound of a tone, or a child to fear moving cars. But to teach an elephant to learn to walk on its hind legs, or a child to say please, we turn to operant conditioning. So classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both forms of associative learning, yet their differences are straightforward. Classical conditioning forms associations between stimuli, which is a conditioned stimuli, and the unconditioned stimulus it signals. It also involves respondent behavior, automatic responses to a stimulus such as salivation in response to meat powder, and later in response to a tone. Now remember earlier when we went over these definitions, a stimulus is any event or situation that invokes a response. And respondent behavior are behaviors that occurs as an automatic response to some stimulus. Okay, so in operant conditioning, organisms associate their own actions with consequences. Actions followed by reinforcers increase. Now, this is definitely on most psychology exams when reviewing learning concepts, okay? So in operant conditioning, remember, operant conditioning is a type of learning in which a behavior becomes more likely to recur if followed by a reinforcer, or less likely to reoccur if followed by a punisher. And on my psych exams, this is definitely on there. So a behavior, any target behavior that is rewarded in various ways, and we'll talk about that later. Any behavior that is rewarded, that particular behavior is most likely to reoccur again. that behavior happening again has increased if it is rewarded. But any behavior that is punished, the likelihood of that behavior occurring again has decreased. Okay? So in operant conditioning, organisms associate their own actions with consequences. Actions followed by reinforcers, does it increase or decrease? That's right. Actions followed by reinforcers increase. Those followed by punishments often decrease. Behavior that operates on the environment to produce rewarding or punishing stimuli is called what? Operant behavior. So operant behavior is any behavior that operates on the environment producing consequences. Operant behavior is behavior that operates on the environment producing consequences. And operant conditioning is a type of learning in which a behavior becomes more likely to reoccur if followed by a reinforcer. And it's less likely to reoccur if followed by a punisher. Okay? And that is so important when trying to differentiate between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And that is something you need to be able to do. You have to be able to differentiate between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both forms of associative learning, and yet they are very different. Classical conditioning forms associations between stimuli. It also involves respondent behavior, which are automatic responses to a stimulus. In operant conditioning, organisms associate their own actions with consequences. Actions followed by reinforcers increase. Actions followed by punishment often decrease. Behavior that operates on the environment to produce rewards or punishments is what? It's called operant behaviors. Okay, so a name you need to associate with operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner. Okay? Just like I told you earlier to associate Ivan Pavlov with classical conditioning, you have got to associate B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning. So, B.F. Skinner was a college English major and aspiring writer who was seeking a new direction. He enrolled as a graduate student in psychology. He went on to become modern behaviorism's most influential and controversial figures. Skinner's work elaborated on what psychologist Thorndike, and that's a name, in classic psychology, Thorndike called the law of effect. The law of effect is Thorndike's principle that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and that behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. So B.F. Skinner, basically elaborated on this. So again, Thorndike's law of effect was used as a starting point. Skinner developed a behavioral technology that revealed principles of behavior control by shaping pigeons' natural walking and pecking behaviors, for example. Skinner was able to teach them such un-pigeon-like behaviors as walking, and there's different pictures of this in my other learning video lecture that actually goes over these experiments a little bit more in detail. For example, for his pioneering studies, Skinner designed an operant chamber, popularly known as a Skinner box. And again, I go over this more in detail in another lecture. But an operant chamber in operant conditioning research is a chamber, also known as the Skinner box, containing a bar or key that an animal can manipulate to obtain a food or water reinforcer. Attached devices record the animal's rate or bar pressing or key pecking. And that again was called an operant chamber. Now, reinforcement is, again, in operant conditioning, any event that strengthens the behavior it follows. Now, I had given you some words of association for classical conditioning. Now, some words of association for operant conditioning would definitely be what? Operant conditioning, the word voluntary, Skinner, B.F. Skinner. Reinforcers or punishers, reinforcement or punishment. These are all words that you need to associate with operant conditioning. Another word in operant conditioning is the word shaping. Okay? So, and shaping is an operant conditioning procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior toward closer and closer approximation of the desired behaviors. So yes, we could actually shape other people's behaviors. I mean, it sounds, a little manipulative, but really that's what it is. And we do it every day. All of us do, but we don't know the technical psychological terminology for it, which is what you're learning now. So imagine that you wanted to condition a hungry rat to press a bar. Like Skinner, you would tease out this action with shaping, gradually, guiding the rat's action towards what? Towards the desired behavior that you wanted to have. That is called shaping. And again, in operant conditioning, it is a procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior towards closer and closer approximation of the desired behavior. Okay? Now, there's positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. There's primary reinforcer and conditioned reinforcer. And let's just go over these definitions right now. Okay? Positive reinforcement means increasing behaviors by presenting positive reinforcers. A positive reinforcer is any stimulus that, when presented after a response, strengthens the response. So a positive reinforcement means increase in behaviors by presenting positive reinforcers. A positive reinforcer is any stimulus that, when presented after a response, it strengthens the response. Okay, so until now, we've mainly been discussing positive reinforcement, which strengthens responding by presenting a typically pleasurable stimulus immediately after the response. Now you need to know this, right? When trying to shape behavior, if you're using positive reinforcement, you have to administer a pleasurable stimulus immediately after the response. It works better when you administer this pleasurable stimulus immediately after the response. Okay? So again, there's different types of reinforcement, and this one is called positive reinforcement, when a pleasurable stimulus is administered immediately after the response. There's also negative reinforcement. Okay? Increasing behaviors by stopping or reducing negative stimuli. A negative reinforcer is any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. Now let's go over this again, but one thing you have to remember: negative reinforcement is not punishment. It's two complete separate things, which we will go over. So there's different types of reinforcers. There's positive reinforcer and there's negative reinforcers. Yes, positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. So negative reinforcement means increasing behaviors by stopping or reducing negative stimuli. A negative reinforcer is any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. And it is not the same thing as negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is not the same thing as punishment. You know what? I think what I'm going to do is put the link in the description of this episode of the lecture I did on learning concepts, okay? And the reason being because I have actual pictures, that a lot of people find more beneficial, that explains the concepts of classical conditioning, of operant conditioning, and of observational learning. And we'll talk about that observational learning in a minute. And it goes over Bandura's Pavlov experiment more in detail. So find the links in the description below this episode of these learning video lectures. Okay? All right, so let's move on. Primary reinforcer is basically a reinforcing stimulus, such as one that satisfies a biological need. So primary reinforcers satisfy a biological need. A condition reinforcer is a stimulus that gains its reinforcing power through its association with a primary reinforcer. And a conditioned reinforcer is also known as a secondary reinforcer. So you have your primary reinforcer and your secondary reinforcer. And secondary reinforcers are also called conditioned reinforcers. Okay? All right, so a reinforcement schedule is a pattern that defines how often a desired response will be reinforced. Reinforcement schedule is a pattern that defines how often a desired response will be reinforced. So, in most of the examples given, the desired response has been reinforced every time it occurs. But reinforcement schedules vary. With continuous reinforcement, learning occurs rapidly, which makes it the best choice for mastering a behavior. Remember that. So with continuous reinforcement, which just means reinforcing the desired response every time it occurs, that is called continuous reinforcement schedule. So with continuous reinforcement, learning occurs rapidly, which means it is the best choice for mastering a behavior. But extinction also occurs rapidly. When reinforcement stops, when we stop delivering food after the rat presses the bar, the behavior soon stops, and that's called extinguished. It has been extinguished. If a normally dependable candy machine fails to deliver a chocolate bar twice in a row, we stop putting money into it. Although a week later, we may exhibit spontaneous recovery by trying again to see if it now works. Okay? So these are all definitions that we need to know. All right. So continuous reinforcement schedule means reinforcing the desired response every time it occurs. Partial or intermittent reinforcement schedule means reinforcing a response only part of the time, results in slower acquisition of a response, but much greater resistance to extinction than does continuous reinforcement. Okay, so there's different types of scheduling in regards to reinforcement schedule. There's continuous reinforcement. There's partial reinforcement schedule. There's a fixed ratio schedule, a variable ratio schedule, fixed interval schedule, variable interval schedule. You see, so there's a lot of different schedules. So reinforcement schedule is just a pattern that defines how often a desired response will be reinforced. Your continuous reinforcement schedule is reinforcing the desired response every time it occurs. Partial or intermediate reinforcement schedule is reinforcing a response only part of the time. Fixed ratio schedule is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response only after a specific number of responses. So it's called a fixed ratio schedule. It only reinforces a response after a specific number of responses, like every third response or every fifth response, there will be a reinforcer. You see what I mean? Now there's a variable ratio schedule when a reinforcer schedule that occurs a response after an unpredictable number of responses. So it's a variable ratio. It's unpredictable. This time it will be every 2 times and every 4 times, every 5, then back to 2. It's a variable ratio schedule. When a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response after an unpredictable number of responses. A fixed interval schedule is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response only after a specific time has lapsed. Fixed interval schedule, right, reinforces a response only after a specific time period. A variable interval schedule, and the word just gives you a clue, variable interval, right? It's a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response at unpredictable time intervals. That's a variable interval schedule. Reinforces a response at unpredictable time intervals. Okay, so we've been talking about reinforcement, okay, a lot. Let's move on to punishment. Punishment is an event that tends to decrease the behavior that it follows. Punishment is an event that tends to decrease the behavior it follows. So, reinforcement increases a behavior. Punishment does the opposite. So, while negative reinforcement increases the frequency of a preceding behavior by withdrawing something negative, a punisher is any consequence that decreases the frequency of a preceding behavior. Okay? All right, so let's see. Many psychologists note 4 major drawbacks to physical punishment, because we know there's different types of punishment. We know that, okay? And in regards to, parenting, physical punishment is done often with some parents, okay? But psychologists now are saying, no, there are definitely drawbacks to physical punishment. And really quickly, the 4 would be: punished behavior is suppressed, not forgotten. Okay, so physical punishment may suppress these type of behaviors, but the behaviors are not forgotten. Also, punishment teaches discrimination among situations. Third, punishment can teach fear. And fourth, physical punishment may increase aggression by modeling violence as a way to cope with problems. So, psychologists are now saying that you should use positive reinforcement, and they call it positive behavior modification techniques, rather than punishment when disciplining children. Okay? All right. So Skinner actually stated that you could apply these operant conditioning techniques in various places. Okay? So psychologists apply operant conditioning principles to help people with a variety of challenges, from moderating, high blood pressure or gaining social skills, for example. Reinforcement techniques are also used at work, in schools, sports, workplaces, homes, and these principles can support our self-improvement as well. So again, these operant conditioning techniques are used at school, and of course, good instruction demands two things. Said Skinner, students must be told immediately whether that they are doing right or wrong. Okay, and when they're doing the right thing, they must be directed to step into taking the next action, and you have to reward these positive actions. Okay, in sports, coaches use operant conditioning to shape behaviors in athletic performance. At work, knowing what reinforcers influence productivity, many organizations have invited employees to share the risks and reward of company ownership. This is rewarding employees, and therefore it creates a greater work performance in these employees. In parenting, it's the same thing. We have seen that parents can learn from operant conditioning practices how to basically shape positive behaviors in their children. Now, to change your own behavior, let's start with that. There are these 5 steps that psychologists, suggest. Okay. So psychologists suggest, taking these steps. 1, state a realistic goal in measurable terms and announce it. 2, decide how, when, and where you will work towards your goal. 3, monitor how often you engage in your desired behavior. 4, reinforce the desired behavior. And 5, reduce the rewards gradually. As your new behaviors become more habits, okay, positive habits that you've adapted, give yourself a mental pat on the back instead of that reward. And we know rewards come in various forms. It could be a food reward, a primary reward, or secondary rewards. Okay? Now, lastly, I want to go over learning by observation really quickly. But again, I've got this video link in the description box that links to a video lecture I did fully in regards to social learning and observational learning. And it goes more in depth with Bandura's Pavlovs Dog Experiment. So I want you to take a look at that learning video lecture after this one. So cognition supports observational learning, in which higher animals, especially humans, learn without direct experience by watching and imitating others. A child who sees his or her sister burn her fingers on a hot stove learns not to touch it. We learn our native language and various other specific behaviors by observing and imitating others, a process called modeling. Okay, so observational learning is simply learning by observing others. Learning via observation, just as it says in the word itself. Observational learning is learning by observing others. And modeling is the process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. Now, this is something you have got to remember, because on some psych quizzes, you will get this wrong. Modeling isn't just learning via observation. There's a second step to it, okay? Sure, it's the process of observing. So you're observing the behavior and learning, okay? But also imitating that specific behavior. That's what modeling is. You're modeling after certain behaviors that you have observed. You are imitating the behaviors that you observe. And we know it could be both positive and negative, right? Positive and negative modeling. And of course, we want to go ahead and and model after positive behaviors, not negative behaviors. And in the social learning and observational learning and Bandura's Pavlovs Dog Experiment video I have in the description, I go more in depth with this, okay? So pro-social behaviors are positive, constructive, helpful behavior, and it is the opposite of antisocial behaviors. So we want to model pro-social behaviors, the good behaviors, and not the antisocial or bad behaviors. Okay, I think this is it for this episode. I think I ran over my usual under an hour, but it's okay. It's okay. Hey, this is Dr. Bev Knox, and you have been listening to my psychology exam study buddy episode, and we just covered learning and also classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And I have got additional links in the description below to assist you in understanding these concepts more in detail. So this is episode 14, basic learning concepts, and episode 15, I'm actually going to go over actual questions and answers pertaining to this topic of learning concepts that you will find in actual psychology exams. All right? Okay, guys, I will see you in the next episode.